The system had already told Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Ibarra twice that Raymond Kessler wasn't in the database, but he typed the name again anyway, slower this time, making sure he hadn't fat-fingered a letter. The cursor blinked in the visitor management field while Ray stood just beyond the painted pedestrian line at Gate 2, hands tucked into the pockets of a thin windbreaker that did nothing against the late winter wind cutting through the lanes. Ray's breath clouded in front of his face as he waited, shoulders slightly hunched, knees stiff from standing too long on the cold concrete. Ibarra's jaw tightened as the screen refreshed, and then a small banner appeared at the top of the result window, something Ibarra hadn't seen before. Archive Personnel / Legacy ID link. He stared at it for a second, then keyed his radio without looking up. Watch, I need a supervisor at Gate 2. System flagged a legacy record. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment with your city or country. And if true stories like this one matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Now back to the story. The gate was busy that morning, the kind of steady flow that made guards impatient with anything that slowed the rhythm. Contractors rolled through the vehicle lanes, CAT cards already out, scanners beeping every few seconds as the line crept forward under the cold sun. Diesel exhaust hung in the air, mixing with the metallic bite of winter and the faint smell of coffee drifting from the guard booth. Ray had walked up to the pedestrian area 20 minutes earlier, polite and quiet, asking if there was a civilian hiring office or contractor trailer he could reach without going through the full visitor process. Ibarra had been polite at first too, running the standard script. Name, date of birth, purpose of visit. But when the system came back empty, no appointment, no sponsor, no active pass, the tone shifted. Ibarra kept his distance behind the barrier line, posture stiff, eyes flicking between Ray and the screen like he was waiting for something to make sense. Ray didn't look like trouble, exactly, but he didn't look like he belonged either. His jeans were worn but clean, the denim faded at the knees and along the seams. His hoodie was layered under the windbreaker, both too light for the temperature, and his shoes were functional but scuffed, the soles compressed from years of use. His face was weathered, deep lines around his mouth and sun damage on his cheeks and nose, and a small pale scar sat just under his right cheekbone. His hair was thin and gray, short-cropped with a receding line, and his hands, large-knuckled with a faint tremor from the cold, showed 2 heel burn marks on the left wrist and nails that were trimmed but stained from occasional labor. He stood with a posture that suggested he'd once carried himself differently, straighter maybe, but now he seemed to be trying to shrink to not take up too much space. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled, sentences short, and he used "sir" automatically when addressing Ibarra, even though Ibarra was half his age. There was something about the way Ray waited, patient but tense, like he was used to systems not working in his favor, that made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. Commander Elena Park had been at the gate area for 15 minutes already, clipboard in hand, conducting a random spot check of access control procedures after a recent audit finding had flagged inconsistencies in visitor log documentation. She was medium height, athletic build, hair pulled back in a regulation bun, uniform pressed with the name tape perfectly aligned. Her eyes were sharp, the kind that caught details others missed, and she moved through the gate lanes with purpose, scanning the flow of traffic and the posture of the guards on duty. When Ibarra's radio call came through, she was standing near the vehicle inspection area, reviewing a logbook entry with a senior enlisted supervisor. She looked up, made brief eye contact with the supervisor, then walked toward Gate 2 without hurrying. By the time she arrived, Ibarra had stepped back from the window, one hand still on the edge of the keyboard, the other gesturing vaguely at the screen. "Ma'am," he said, straightening slightly when he saw her. Unscheduled walk-up, no visitor entry, but the system threw a legacy personnel flag when I ran his name. I've never seen that before. Park stepped into the booth, leaned toward the monitor, and read the banner herself. The flag was sparse, just a note that an archived record existed, tied to an old identifier, with a link to a restricted query page she'd need credentials to access. She turned her head slightly, looking through the booth window at Ray, who was still standing at the line, hands in his pockets, eyes down. "What's he asking for?" she asked. Ibarra glanced at his notes. "Says he's looking for day labor work. Wanted to know if there's a contractor office he could talk to. No sponsor, no appointment. Gave me his name and DOB. That's when the flag came up." Park nodded once, then stepped outside the booth and walked to the barrier line. Ray looked up when she approached, his hazel eyes meeting hers briefly before he looked away again, not submissive exactly, but cautious. "Sir," Park said, her tone direct but not hostile. "I'm Commander Park, Security Forces. The system's showing an archive personnel record tied to your name. Can you tell me about your military service?" Ray hesitated for just a second, then answered in that same quiet, control voice. "Navy. Long time ago. Left in '89. I don't have my papers anymore. Lost them in a move." Park studied him for a moment, then made a decision. "We're going to move you to the Pass and ID office for control verification. You'll be escorted. Don't wander." "Understood." Ray nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He hadn't always been the man standing at a gate asking for work he wasn't sure he'd get. There had been years, 16 of them, from 1973 to 1989, when Raymond Allen Kessler had been Lieutenant Commander Kessler, a naval aviator with a call sign that stuck because it was accurate. They called him Ledger after a deployment workup when he caught a mismatch between a maintenance sign-off and a loadout note and insisted it be reconciled before launch. It wasn't dramatic, just careful, the kind of attention to detail that prevented delays and potential hazards. After a few saves like that, someone joked he flew like an accountant, and the name stuck because Ray kept things balanced: fuel, time, risk, and the details everyone else rushed past. He'd been known for mission planning discipline and checklist rigor, for being calm under pressure, and for building bridges between maintenance, operations, and aircrew without letting ego get in the way. He wasn't a hero in the Hollywood sense. He was the pilot people trusted when the margins were thin and the decisions mattered. His reputation had been built on quiet professionalism. If Ledger says it's not right, it's not right. He doesn't raise his voice. He just doesn't budge. He'll put it in writing. That's how you know he means it. In the squadron's internal readiness system, Ray had earned a Level 1 qualification, a label for pilots who were fully mission-capable across the most demanding profiles and eligible for instructor and evaluator duties. It wasn't a public medal or something a random civilian would recognize, but it showed up in training records and archived readiness rosters, a quiet marker of trust and competence. His philosophy had come from an older instructor early in the pipeline, delivered after a near miss was traced to close enough work. Standards don't change for comfort. Ray had carried that with him through carrier night recoveries in the Western Pacific, when conditions degraded faster than predicted, and he'd pressed for divert criteria to be applied consistently rather than letting pride push unsafe approaches. He carried it through functional check flights when a minor warning light suggested something was within tolerance, but his gut said the response lag was off, and he'd run the full profile by the book and refused to call it good until maintenance found the component that could have failed under load. He'd carried it through training events when he'd called a knock it off to protect a task-saturated junior pilot and documented the incident so the pilot would get help instead of punishment. And he'd carried it through a readiness inspection in 1988 when he'd helped build a corrective plan instead of covering up inconsistencies. Even though the short-term operational impact was painful, Ray had been the kind of officer who treated readiness as an honest ledger, not a performance. But that same refusal to smooth the edges had cost him. In February 1987, during an evaluation sortie for a junior pilot's upgrade, Ray had been flying in winter weather that was building faster than forecast. The conditions were marginal, ceilings shifting, visibility dropping, crosswind components increasing, and the radio rhythm changed as controllers got busier and transmissions got clipped. Ray had watched the junior pilot's voice speed up, watched 2 deviations turn into a pattern, and made the call to terminate early and reset the sequence rather than pressing a sloppy approach in tightening weather. Back in the operation spaces that smelled like coffee and wet jackets, the debrief had been procedural, not dramatic, but Ray had documented the event honestly. The junior pilot's upgrade would be delayed. A higher-up had suggested softening the write-up to protect readiness metrics before an upcoming inspection visit, and Ray had refused. He wasn't angry, just firm. That refusal had narrowed his pathway to a cushier staff role and created a quiet but real friction with leadership. A chief named Tom Riley, who'd worked with Ray on readiness documentation, had backed Ray's accurate reporting in a meeting and taken heat for it. Tom was later reassigned and took early retirement under pressure. Ray had completed the paperwork, signed what he wrote, and watched the junior pilot get assigned remedial training. But he'd gone home with the growing awareness that doing the right thing didn't guarantee support. By 1989, he'd separated from active duty at the rank of lieutenant commander, his reserve affiliation fading as civilian work took over and the paperwork grew inconsistent. The civilian years had been stable at first. Aviation-adjacent logistics work, then operations management when flying jobs didn't stick, but Ray's knee pain had become a daily negotiation. Standing too long, climbing stairs, long drives all extracted a price, and he'd become rigid about routines because routines reduce mistakes. He'd missed a medical appointment once because he'd taken an extra shift to cover rent, and the paperwork to reschedule had gotten lost in mail forwarding. He'd started avoiding phone calls that involved forms because each call meant hold times and re-explaining his history. Over the 1990s and early 2000s, he'd stayed employed but never stable. When companies changed hands, HR systems migrated and old records got mismatched. He'd moved apartments several times, and mail had gotten returned, and he'd missed renewal notices. He'd tried the VA once, gotten stuck in a loop, "We need your DD 214, and he'd had it until a later move when a box went missing. He'd requested replacements, but the process had felt like a maze, and meanwhile the pain had worsened. He'd relied on over-the-counter meds, then occasional prescriptions he didn't always refill on time. A layoff in his late 60s had been followed by a rent increase and a minor car repair he couldn't afford. He'd fallen behind, then tried to catch up with gig work, telling himself it was temporary. He'd stopped paying for a storage unit first, then stopped renewing a P.O. box, believing he could restart once he had a steady address again. He'd taken a backpack with a few clothes, a cheap phone, and a folder with partial paperwork, some copies, some outdated. He'd left furniture, books, most personal items. He hadn't said goodbye to former coworkers or distant family because he hadn't wanted them to see him failing. The shame had been quiet, not dramatic. For about 2 years, he'd rotated between a seasonal shelter, a cheap weekly motel when he could afford it, and sleeping in his older sedan when money ran out. He'd survived on day labor, recycling cans when necessary, occasional church meal lines, and short-term temp jobs that ended when he couldn't keep up physically. He'd held on to 2 things: a laminated photocopy of an old military ID card, not valid but had his name and an old DoD ID number, and a folded medical summary from a clinic visit listing knee and back diagnosis. A shelter intake worker had once suggested a veterans outreach program, but Ray hadn't followed through because he'd lacked documents and hadn't wanted another bureaucratic dead end. This morning, he'd spent the night in his car near an industrial strip, and when he'd seen a hiring sign for a contractor that did grounds and facilities work near the base, he'd called the number. The line had redirected him to a recorded message: apply online. Ray's phone was old, and he didn't have stable email access. He'd driven to the industrial gate area thinking he could find a walk-in office, but signage and public directions had pointed him to the main security gate instead. He'd asked the guard if there was a civilian hiring trailer or pass and ID office he could reach, and the guard had followed procedure. Without a sponsor or appointment, Ray was treated as an unscheduled visitor. The guard had asked for his name and date of birth to check the visitor log, and Ray had provided it. When his name didn't appear in visitor appointments, the guard had checked again, typed slower, and then the screen had revealed an archive personnel link tied to Ray's old identifier, forcing escalation. Drop a comment if you've ever watched someone be completely misjudged at first glance. We read as many as we can, and your stories help remind others they're not alone. Now, back to what happened next. The Pass and ID office was a short drive inside the gate, and Ray was escorted there in a marked security vehicle, sitting in the back with his folder on his lap and his hands folded over it. The building was small and functional, fluorescent lights overhead, waiting chairs bolted to the floor, a ticket dispenser by the door, and service windows with glass partitions separating staff from visitors. Dana Whitcomb, the pass and ID supervisor, was 58, wearing reading glasses on a chain and a cardigan under her jacket, her badge on a lanyard, and practical shoes that suggested she spent most of her day on her feet. She'd been working in installation access programs for years, dealing with mismatched IDs, name changes, old DoD numbers, and database migrations that left gaps in the system. When Commander Park walked right to her window and explained the situation, legacy personnel flag, no current visitor record, requesting verification, Dana's expression didn't change. She simply nodded, asked Ray to take a seat, and began following the steps she knew by heart. She checked his name and date of birth against the document he had, a laminated photocopy of an old military ID that was cloudy at the edges and worn from being carried in a wallet for years. She asked for his social security number, and Ray hesitated for just a second before providing it, his voice quiet and careful. Dana ran a search in the access system, then tried the legacy identifier from the laminated copy, typing it into a separate query field used for archived records. The system returned a partial hit, an old service record pointer, and a note about archived training jacket entries. It wasn't enough for access or full identity confirmation, so Dana used the fingerprint scanner at her station, asking Ray to place his right index finger on a glass. The scan took a few seconds, then matched against a database that cross-referenced old personnel files. Commander Park stood nearby, not hovering, but ensuring chain of custody and proper handling, her eyes moving between the screen and Ray's face. Ibarra, who'd driven Ray to the office, stood near the door, arms crossed, his earlier confidence replaced by something that looked like embarrassment mixed with confusion. Ray sat very still, his hands resting on his knees stiff and aching from the cold and the tension. He worried they'd decide he was lying, that the photocopy wasn't enough, that he'd be escorted back to the gate and told to leave. Dana printed a screen summary for the file, then picked up the phone and called a base records liaison number listed in her directory for legacy inquiries. She explained the situation in a calm, procedural voice, read the identifier aloud, and waited while the person on the other end ran their own search. The liaison call took 4 minutes, and when Dana hung up, her expression had shifted slightly. Not dramatic, just a quiet recalibration. She looked at Commander Park first, then at Ray. The identifier ties to Raymond A. Kessler, naval aviator, separated 1989, last rank lieutenant commander, she said, reading from the notes she'd taken during call. The liaison referenced archived training and evaluation entries, showing Level 1 qualification status in the unit readiness system of that era and an evaluator designation. Ray's shoulders dropped just a little, relief mixing with exhaustion. "That's me," he said quietly. "I haven't used that number in years." Park's posture changed too. She uncrossed her arms, took a half step closer, and her voice lost the edge of authority it had carried at the gate. "Okay," she said. "Now we can move to what we can actually do today." Ibarra shifted his weight near the door, his face flushing slightly, and he looked down at his boots. Dana's tone stayed steady, professional, but there was a softness in it now that hadn't been there before. "What are you requesting, sir?" she asked Ray. Ray met her eyes, and for the first time that morning, his voice didn't sound like he was trying to shrink. "I need a path that's real," he said. "Not another phone tree." Dana printed an official verification memo for internal use, a single page with Ray's name, service dates, and the confirmation from the records liaison. Commander Park requested a brief summary from the liaison over a follow-up call. Service dates 1973 to 1989, last unit type operational squadron with test and evaluation support responsibilities, qualification note indicating Level 1 readiness status, and evaluator track. Park ran procedural cross-checks through security channels. No warrants, not barred from base, identity confirmed. She directed a senior enlisted assistant to connect Ray with the base's Fleet and Family Support Office, which had a veteran liaison program, and arranged for a controlled escort to take him there. Word spread quietly among the staff in the building, whispered between the senior enlisted and a clerk who'd been standing near the printer, passed along to another guard who'd come in for a shift change. That guy at the counter is a former LCDR pilot, someone said, and the tone in the room shifted. No one made it ceremonial. No one saluted or stood at attention. But the way people looked at Ray changed. Eyes that had been dismissive or indifferent now held something closer to respect, and voices that had been clipped and procedural softened just slightly. Park documented the incident in her duty log as a case study in how legacy records could appear in modern systems and how to handle them without creating security gaps or dismissing people who deserve verification. She brought the summary to the Security Forces Watch office and briefed a senior officer on what had happened, emphasizing the procedural steps that had worked and the gaps that needed attention. What would you do in this situation? If you're standing there, would you step in or stay quiet and watch? Tell us in the comments what your honest reaction would be. Now, let's see what they did. The recognition didn't happen all at once, but it built in layers over the next hour as more people became aware of who Ray had been. Commander Park stood in the watch office with a verification memo in her hand and made a decision that wasn't required by regulation but felt necessary. She called the base administration office and asked if there was a senior officer available who handled retired affairs or personnel transitions. The call was transferred twice before it reached a captain who'd been in the Navy long enough to remember when Level 1 qualifications were still part of the readiness lexicon, before the systems had been modernized and the language had changed. The captain asked a few questions: what aircraft, what time frame, what squadrons, and then said he'd come down and meet Ray in person. When he arrived 20 minutes later, he was in working khakis, no ceremony, just a quiet professionalism that matched the tone Ray had carried his whole career. He shook Ray's hand, introduced himself, and asked Ray to walk him through the basics. When he'd served, where he'd been stationed, what he'd flown. Ray answered in short, factual sentences, no embellishment, and the captain listened without interrupting. When Ray mentioned the call sign Ledger, the captain's expression changed, not shock, but recognition. I've heard that name, he said. In a safety briefing, maybe 10 years ago, something about a functional check flight and a write-up that caught a component failure. Ray nodded slowly. March 82, NAS stateside. Minor warning light. Response lag fell off. I ran the full check profile, wrote the discrepancies. Maintenance found the part later. The captain shook his head slightly, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Standards don't change, he said, and Ray looked up sharply, surprised. That's what the briefing said. Standards don't change for comfort. They used your write-up as an example. The room had grown quiet, and Petty Officer Ibarra, who'd been standing near the door the whole time, finally spoke. His voice was low, almost apologetic. I didn't know, sir, he said, looking at Ray. I have to follow the system. Ray turned to him, and his expression wasn't angry or hurt, just tired. You did, he said simply, and Ibarra's shoulders dropped a little, the tension easing. Commander Park stepped forward then, her voice firm and clear. Mr. Kessler, we're going to arrange an appointment with a veteran service officer here on base. We'll provide a temporary mailing address through a partner program, so you have a stable contact point while your documentation is being processed. We'll also coordinate transportation and confirm the appointment by phone before you leave today. She paused, then added, this isn't charity. This is what should have happened years ago. The records liaison had emailed a summary document while they were talking, a redacted excerpt from Ray's archive training jacket that confirmed his Level 1 qualification and evaluator designation, along with a note referencing his FitRep lines about safety culture and readiness management. Dana printed it and placed it in a folder along with a verification memo, instructions for requesting a DD-214 replacement using the standard Form 180, contact names for the Fleet and Family Office, and an appointment time for the following morning. She handed the folder to Ray, and he took it carefully, holding it like it might disappear if he wasn't careful enough. What happens next? He asked, and Dana answered with the same calm, procedural tone she'd used all morning. You take this to the appointment tomorrow. They'll help you navigate the replacement process and get you reconnected with benefits. It's going to take time, weeks, maybe months, but this is the start. The validation that followed wasn't loud or public in the way ceremonies are, but it was real. The captain made a brief statement to the small group gathered in the office: Commander Park, Dana, Ibarra, the senior enlisted assistant, and a clerk who'd been helping with the paperwork. He introduced Ray by his full name, rank, and service dates, and he listed the accomplishments that had appeared in the archived records. The Knight recovery decision in November 1978 that had prevented a mishap by pressing for consistent divert criteria when conditions degraded. The functional check flight in March 1982 that had caught a critical system anomaly before it could fail under high-load conditions. The training incident management in August 1986 when Ray had called a knock it off to protect a task-saturated junior pilot and documented it so the pilot would get help instead of punishment. And the cross-community coordination during a readiness inspection in May 1988 when Ray had built a corrective plan instead of covering up inconsistencies. The captain's voice was steady and factual, not dramatic, but the weight of the words settled over the room like a physical presence. When he finished, no one spoke for several seconds. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are processing something they hadn't expected to encounter on an ordinary morning. Dana stepped forward then, holding the folder she'd prepared, and she addressed Ray directly. "Sir, I've worked in this office for almost 20 years, she said, and her voice was calm, but there was emotion underneath it now, carefully controlled. I've seen a lot of people come through here who fell through the cracks. The system isn't perfect, and sometimes it fails people who did everything right. You did everything right." She handed him the folder, and Ray took it with both hands, his fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. He looked down at the folder, at the papers inside that represented a path forward, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility that the ledger might balance again, that the standards he'd tried to live by might actually mean something in a world that had felt increasingly indifferent to people like him. Commander Park moved closer, and when she spoke, her voice had lost all the procedural distance it had carried earlier. "Mr. Kessler, we're going to make sure you get to that appointment tomorrow. We're going to make sure you have what you need to move forward. And if the process stalls anywhere, you call this office and ask for me personally." She wrote her direct line on a card and handed it to him, and Ray stared at it for a moment before folding it carefully and putting it in his shirt pocket. Petty Officer Ibarra stepped forward then, hesitant but determined, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been shame or respect or both. "Sir, I'm sorry," he said. I should have." He trailed off, unable to find the right words, and Ray looked at him for a long moment. "You followed the rules," Ray said quietly. "That's what you're supposed to do. The system failed, not you." Ibarra's eyes were red-rimmed, and he nodded once, sharply, then stepped back. The clerk who'd been standing near the printer, a young woman barely out of her teens, wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, and the senior enlisted assistant, a chief with 25 years in, stood a little straighter and looked at Ray with an expression that suggested he was seeing something he'd thought didn't exist anymore. Proof that the old standards still mattered. The captain shook Ray's hand again, and this time he held it a little longer. "Welcome back," he said, and Ray didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded. The practical help came quickly after that. Commander Park coordinated with the Fleet and Family Office to arrange a temporary shelter placement through a veteran outreach program, with transportation provided to get Ray there that afternoon. She confirmed the appointment time for the following morning and made sure Ray had a printed copy of the address, the contact name, and a case number he could reference. When Ray hesitated, saying he needed to keep his car keys and his folder because they were all he had, Park didn't argue. She just made a note that his vehicle would be allowed to remain in a designated lot temporarily and that his personal belongings would stay with him. Ray left the office just after noon, escorted to a shuttle van that would take him to the shelter intake point, and as he walked out the door, he turned back once and looked at the people who'd helped him. They were already returning to their work, Dana typing at her computer, Park reviewing another log, Ibarra heading back to the gate. But the moment had changed something fundamental in the way they saw their jobs and the people who came through their doors. If this story hit you even a little, consider subscribing so more people can hear stories like this. It helps the channel more than you know. Now, here's what happened in the days and months after that moment. The same day, Ray arrived at the shelter intake office with his folder, his laminated ID copy, and the verification memo from base. The intake counselor, a man in his 40s who'd worked with veterans for years, read through the paperwork carefully, then looked up at Ray with an expression that was both professional and kind. "You've got a solid start here," he said. "We can place you in transitional housing tonight, and we'll work with the Veterans Service Officer to make sure your benefits process keeps moving." Ray sat in a plastic chair in the small office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and he asked the questions he'd learned to ask after 2 years of unstable housing. "Can I keep my car? Can I keep my phone? What happens if I miss an appointment?" The counselor answered each question patiently, writing down the answers so Ray would have them in writing, and Ray felt a small knot of tension in his chest begin to loosen. That night, he slept in a single room in a transitional facility, the bed narrow but clean, the door lockable from the inside, and he lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and trying to believe that this wasn't temporary, that the system had finally caught him instead of letting him fall. 2 weeks later, Ray had a stable mailing address through the Transitional Housing Program, and he'd attended 3 appointments. One with the Veterans Service Officer to begin the DD-214 replacement process, one with a VA enrollment counselor to restart his benefits claim, and one with a physical therapy clinic to address his chronic knee and back pain. The paperwork was still slow, the phone calls still required patience, but this time Ray had people helping him navigate the maze, and he had proof, written, stamped, official proof, that he was who he said he was. The pain was still present, a daily reminder of decades of wear. But he had a referral for treatment now, and he'd been given a prescription that he could actually afford to refill. He got a temporary day labor placement with a contractor that worked off base, doing yard maintenance and light facility support, and the work was hard on his knee, but it was legitimate and it paid regularly. He kept his routines, rising early, checking his folder to make sure all his documents were in order, writing down every appointment and phone number in a small notebook he'd started carrying, because routines had kept him alive when everything else was falling apart, and he wasn't ready to let them go. 6 months later, Ray had received his DD-214 replacement through the official verification process, and his VA enrollment had been reactivated with backdated benefits that gave him a small cushion of stability he hadn't felt in years. He had a room in a shared apartment through a veteran housing program. Nothing fancy but clean and safe, with a lock on the door and a small desk where he kept his folder and his notebook. His knees still ached when the weather changed, and he still moved carefully when standing too long, but he had access to regular care now, and the worst of the pain was managed. He'd found a volunteer position at the Base Fleet and Family Support Office, working a few hours a week at the intake desk, helping other veterans navigate the same bureaucratic systems that had almost swallowed him. He recognized the look in their eyes, the wary hope mixed with exhaustion, the fear that this time would be just like all the other times when the system had promised help and delivered only more forms and dead ends. When they sat across from him and told their stories in halting, defensive voices, Ray listened without judgment, and he explained the steps in the same calm, procedural tone Dana had used with him. Here's what you need. Here's who you call. Here's what you bring. He kept the ledger straight, documenting every case carefully so nothing would fall through the cracks. And when someone got frustrated or angry, Ray stayed patient. Standards don't change, he said once to a younger veteran who was ready to walk out after being told he needed one more form. It's not comfort, but it's how we get you through. The younger veteran had stared at him, confused, and Ray had smiled just a little. Sit back down. Let's figure out which form and where to get it. One afternoon in late summer, Ray was at the intake desk when a contractor walked in, agitated and impatient, demanding to see someone about a delayed background check that was holding up his base access. The clerk at the desk was new, overwhelmed, and the contractor's voice was getting louder. Ray stood up from his chair slowly, his knees stiff from sitting too long, and he walked over to the desk. "Sir," he said quietly, and the contractor turned to glare at him. "I understand you're frustrated. Let's start with your name and what office you've been working with." The contractor's anger deflated slightly in the face of Ray's calm, and he gave his information in short, clipped sentences. Ray wrote it down, asked 2 clarifying questions, then picked up the phone and called the Pass and ID office directly. He spoke to Dana, explained the situation, and within 10 minutes the contractor had a clear answer and a timeline. The contractor left without thanking anyone, but the clerk looked at Ray with something close to awe. "How did you do that?" she asked, and Ray shrugged. "You just follow the process," he said. "And you don't let people's frustration become your frustration." It was a lesson he'd learned a long time ago, in cockpits and operation spaces and readiness meetings where the stakes were higher than a delayed background check. But the principle was the same. Keep the ledger balanced, don't let emotion override procedure, and don't budge when the standard matters. The system had missed Raymond Kessler for years, had let him slip through gaps created by database migrations and lost paperwork, and a bureaucracy that moved too slowly for people whose lives were moving too fast in the wrong direction. But the system had also caught him, eventually, because someone had followed the procedure when a legacy flag appeared on a screen, and because other people had chosen to treat verification as something that mattered, not just another box to check. Ray still carried the laminated photocopy of his old military ID in his wallet, even though he had official documents now, because it reminded him of the years when that flimsy piece of plastic was the only proof he had that he'd once been someone the system valued. He carried the folder too, thicker now with appointment summaries and benefit letters and contact names, because he'd learned that survival often came down to what you could prove on paper. And he carried the phrase, "Standards don't change," not as a burden anymore, but as a truth that had brought him back from the edge. Standards for what was real, what was documented, what was owed, and what could be rebuilt if someone was willing to do the work and follow the steps, one at a time, until the ledger finally balanced. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If you believe these stories matter, stories about real people, real systems, and the moments when both succeed and fail, please subscribe so we can keep sharing them. And if you want to see another story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most, check out the video on screen now.